Hello again, everyone. I'm Scott Simon, Simon Says, and this will be episode 31 of Simon Says Stories. We're going to address the government shutdown, particularly two major errors I find about it. I'll explain why in just a moment. But first, a Happy New Year to you in 2019, and I am back doing podcasts. Why did I stop? Well, listen to episode 30 and you'll find out why. Much of that project has been completed, so I'm going to devote attention back to the podcast, and we will have interviews with some of the folks we had last year. We'll talk about travel, the economy, and other issues of the day. But first, the issue of the day in 2019 is this government shutdown. And the first issue that I have is that it's titled incorrectly. Who titled it that way? The media. After all, they're in the business of telling us what affects us. And the shutdown does affect us, especially those of us who fly. There are fewer TSA agents at the airport staying home instead of going on the job without a paycheck. But it's not that disruptive, according to people I've spoken with in recent days who have flown. It's not a shutdown, it's a standoff. Let's call it for what it is. It's a government standoff between the president, Nancy Pelosi, and Chuck Schumer. Now, I promised you I will not get political on this podcast, and I won't. I'm not going to assess blame to anyone because that's part of the problem we have in this country, is that we're too busy blaming others instead of solving the problem. So let's get right to the core solution. One, call it for what it is. It's a government standoff. It's a standoff between three people, and a lot of people are affected. Which brings me to the second part of this podcast, the second error. This standoff is not 30 days old. It's only 17 days old. Now, how did I come up with that number? Easy. The government standoff began on Saturday, December 22nd. That means 5 weekends the government has had offices that weren't going to be open anyway. That totals 10 days. Then there's Christmas Day and January 1st. Offices weren't going to be open those 2 days. And President Trump ordered offices closed on Christmas Eve, Monday, December 24th. So that's 3 days added to the 10 weekend days. That's 13 minus 30. And that's how I got up to 17 days that the government has been in a standoff. It's not a shutdown, and it's not 30 days long. Now, there are going to be those of you who say, well, Scott, there are government offices and departments that do work on weekends. The TSA, naturally. Border Patrol, they patrol 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year in a non-leap year. And that's why it's a partial government shutdown. Don't say government shutdown, because that means it's the whole government. It's just a partial government shutdown. But the core focus should be titled government standoff, because it's just one side blaming the other, and we're at the end of the rope trying to hang on. Maybe if we title things correctly, we won't blame each other. I think back to my father, who was an aerospace engineer, and the phrase out of their mouth all the time was solve the problem. We don't hear that today. All we hear is blame. Blame this, blame that, blame them, blame him, blame her. Enough of it already. Solve the problem. How can we do that? That'll just have to be a topic for another episode. So if you would, please join with me, and don't call this a government shutdown. Call it a government standoff, and don't identify it by the number of days the media tell you how long it is. Subtract holidays, subtract weekends, because many government offices are closed on the weekends and holidays. That's episode 31 of Simon Says. Again, I hope you have a happy new year in 2019. We will come back once a week with a podcast of issues of the day that I will comment on. I also will entertain interviews throughout the year. And I do have to report that this podcast is becoming successful. Slowly but surely, it's becoming successful. As of today, and this podcast started last July, I now have had 3,160 downloads. That surpasses my expectations and probably would be more if I had done more podcasts past mid-November. But I got busy with things, and that's fine. We all do. I'm going to devote a little more attention to the podcast, continue writing my book, The United States of Anything Goes, and of course, what we're seeing today with this government standoff, that will be a topic in the book. So until next time, I'm Scott Simon. Simon Says, saying so long from the greatest city in the world, Las Vegas, Nevada.